We're going to be looking at covenants. And covenants are something that we look at in the Bible, and Exodus is one of these places where covenants come up. And I think it's interesting because we've kind of gone through this already. We've talked about covenants before, but today's focus is covenants again, because in the Bible there's no real perfect word for the word covenant. The Hebrew word covenant, best translated, either means a promise or covenant. But in that idea of a covenant, it's this formal agreement that is being made. And so on that note, as we get going, I want to get your guys' thoughts. What is the biggest or most important covenant or promise you have made in your life? What is one of the most significant promises that you've made in your life? Yeah.
To be there for your wife and kids.
Yeah. So making a promise to your family that you're going to be there. Yeah.
For better or worse.
For better or for worse, yes. On the good days and the bad.
Till death do you part.
We should just bring out that ceremony thing. And yeah. Any other promises that you've made? For those that are not married, there are promises that you can make outside of that. What other promises have you made in your life that are important to you? I'm staring at all the younger people because I know that you've made promises in your life.
Get that oath of enlistment.
Oath of enlistment, yeah. That was a big promise for 3 of us in this room, yeah.
Saying that, you say that and then you're just like, ooh, that's real.
Yes. Yeah. Anybody else? Other promises that you made?
I feel like that enlistment includes life.
That's fair.
I'm just saying.
That's
I
fair.
agree.
So 3 plus 3, 4, like, yeah, so we've got a lot of other people that have done this. We've got a lot of veterans and veterans' wives in the room.
When you buy a
Anybody?
house and you have to sign that line that you're actually going to pay that mortgage back.
That's
That's a really
600 signatures?
Yeah.
Yes. Plus your initials.
Because in all reality, there's a lot of promises in our life, right? Like we daily make promises. Those aren't necessarily formal. Hi. Do you have a promise? No. Okay. I mean, you waved at me, so I just thought you wanted to say something. We make a lot of promises in our life. And I looked at this picture before, and this might look familiar to you, but here are 3 areas that I experienced or got to see promises with my wife. With buying a house, that was a
That is
really
a great dress, I'm sorry.
traumatic.
That's one of the best wedding dresses of all time.
Oh, I thought you were talking about my
Dress?
Thank you. And that's my brother-in-law who is being sworn in as well to the Air Force. And so those are all 3 examples of formalized promises and covenants that have been made. All of what we've talked about in the 2 minutes that we've been doing this so far, things that we already went through back in Genesis chapter 12, chapter 15, and other places with the covenant of Abraham. And so the Abrahamic covenant, I just want to go back to that very quickly, was this. The promise God made to Abraham was a one-sided, unilateral, and unconditional covenant or promise that was made to him. And it's reiterated over and over and over again in the book of Genesis. But then we get to the book of Exodus, and what we see is that there is another covenant, there's another promise that is being made. And we're not going to look at Abraham's covenant today. We're going to look at a covenant with Israel, with the group and now nation of Israel and their leader, who's kind of the mediator, lawyer between them, between God and the people of Israel, Moses. And what we're going to see is that this promise that is being made in Exodus is not the same kind of promise that was made to Abraham. In fact, there's a lot of differences there. And so what we have to understand is how do these intersect and go together? And then how do they differentiate? How do they go apart from each other? Because God doesn't just say, hey, I'm going to make a promise with Abraham. Never mind, I'm going to make a new promise over here. These 2 promises coincide and go together. They're different, but they also have purposes that are distinct. So how are the 2 promises the same, and how are they different? I just want to read this. This is a mouthful, but hopefully if you forget everything else that's said, maybe there's something that comes out of this. The Mosaic Covenant made by God with the nation of Israel contributed to the restoration of God's purposes for mankind by setting apart Israel as the nation that would further the fulfillment of the Abrahamic Covenant. So as we're looking at this, we're saying, okay, here's kind of the timeline of all of history. Here's what we're going from, and here's where we're going. And at some point, God kind of decided, hey, I'm going to step in, and I'm going to have a relationship with this nation, Israel. Instead of me just kind of going through and saying, well, there's Noah here, and there's Abraham here, and there's this random thing. Like, no, I'm going to display myself, and I'm going to show myself off with this nation specifically. And so he says the fulfillment of the Abrahamic Covenant, carrying out symbols and types that illumined God's plan of redemption and demonstrate the futility of any salvation based on personal righteousness. Jeff, I'm going to ask you to hold up a broken vase over there. I forgot to grab it. I'm going to just keep this around just so I don't have to continue to break vases. But as you look around there, we've broken a couple vases here because it's a realization that our world started off as enough because God was enough. It started off good because God is good, and then we came along and we broke it. And in our brokenness, what we're dealing with now is God is inserting himself into a broken world and saying, I am going to, in the middle of the brokenness, I am going to show my redemption. I am going to buy back. I am going to do something that if you were left to your own standards, man, you would be broken all the way through. And so here's what we're going to see is a lot, and we're going to try to cover this as quickly as possible because I know that we've got things to do, but this is like exciting stuff for me. Like this is stuff where it's like you kind of get to see the whole picture of the Bible start to come together, and you've got all these questions about like what's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Why are these things here and what's going on? And a lot of it gets answered right here in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're just going to go through 4 books of the Bible today. No big deal. And we're going to go through and look at the Mosaic Covenant. And we're going to look at the context of this covenant, the content of the covenant, the ceremony of the covenant, and the conditions and continuations of the covenant. And covenant is a big word, so I'm just going to look at the promise. I'm going to use that word promise because it is a promise that God is making with the nation of Israel. So we're going to wrap through this as quickly as I can, and I'm going to take a deep breath and
You should do it as a wrap.
yeah, man. I don't have that much. I don't have that much swag. I can't do that. We're going to look at the context of the promise, and this is important, but it's something that for the last 2 weeks we've really already been talking about. The context of the promise. God flooded Pharaoh in their negotiations, figuratively and literally. God just came in and said, here's how it's going to be. I'm going to redeem Israel out of slavery. He used snakes, bloody water, frogs, gnats, mosquitoes, flies, dead stock instead of livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, death of the firstborn sons, and the Red Sea drowning the armies of Egypt. He did all of that to prove, here's who I am, and I'm going to get my people to where I want them to be. Then Exodus 15 comes along, and water miraculously is given to 2 million people in the middle of a desert. And I forgot to put this in my slides, but there's this picture that if you go on Google Earth or Google Maps, and you say, hey, I'm going to type in the Red Sea. And you type in the Red Sea, and you got the Red Sea right there. And then on either side of the Red Sea, it is a barren wasteland today. Like it's a barren wasteland. So you just think about, hey, we're coming out of Egypt, this African country that doesn't have a whole lot of water going on, and we're going to go across to the Middle Eastern area of the Sudan area, and it's just barren. And so they're all sitting there saying, hey, we've got all this gold and silver, which is nice, but we don't have any water. And God says, well, I'll just give you water. And he gives water to the entire nation. Exodus 16 comes along, and he gives them manna, and he gives them bread. He gives them meat from heaven. He just pours out miracle after miracle on the nation of Israel. Exodus 17 comes along. Meat and bread require more water. And so God finds a rock in the middle of the wilderness, and he says, hey, I'm going to just make a geyser out of this, and I'm going to give you more water. Exodus 17 also tells about how Israel is attacked by the Amalekites. And the Amalekites come because they're, hey, wait, we can attack this nation because they are slaves, they are broken down people, and if Egypt couldn't keep them, we're going to take them for ourselves. And so we got this amazing story in Exodus chapter 17 about how when Moses puts up the staff, they're winning the battle, and when he puts it down, they're losing it. But God protects them in a miraculous fashion from becoming slaves to another group of people right after he frees them from Egypt. And if you aren't impressed with what God is capable of doing for the nation of Israel yet, he continues to go. I don't know what else you could say. Like that's the pivotal piece of why and how God is able to be powerful and protect them. But you keep going. Look at Exodus chapter 19, and I actually want to start reading from the Bible instead of me just telling you about what it says. But Exodus chapter 19, verse 16. And chapter 19 is a very interesting chapter because all of what it is Israel preparing themselves to have a conversation with God. He says, before you can have a conversation with me, Israel, I want you to prepare yourself. And so all of Exodus chapter 19 is God wanting them to prepare themselves. And so Exodus chapter 19, verse 16 says this. It says, so it came about on the third day when it was morning that there was thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. So Israel comes to this area in the wilderness, and God says, hey, I want to have a conversation with you, Israel. And they get to the mountain, and this mountain isn't just this nice little like rocky mountain picturesque idea. Instead, what it describes in verse 16 is there is some massive natural disasters all concentrated where God is going to have a conversation with them. And so the people tremble. The people are fearful. He tells them, wash your garments, don't touch the mountain or you will die. And in Exodus chapter 19, verse 18 and 19, here's how it's described. It says, now Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Now if a mountain is on fire, you run the other direction. But God's saying, no, this is where I am, and so I want you to be close. Don't get too close because then you will die. He says, descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. This is who God is in his power. And in verse 19 it says, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. This is just God just showing up in one little spot on planet Earth, in this one little mountain, and he is causing destruction everywhere just because he's so big. I mean, you think about like as a kid, you walk up to an anthill, and you're like, man, I could pour some water down here. I could just like step on it and rub it into the ground. Like there's a lot of things I can do because I just am so powerful compared to these ants. And God shows up on this mountain, and he makes the people that he just rescued from Egypt terrified of him because of how powerful he is. And ultimately, what I look at in chapter 24 is that God just continues to show himself off. Chapter 24, verse 9 through 11. It says, then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles and the sons of Israel, and they saw God, and they ate and drank. Man, they got to see God in his glory. And then in verse 15 through 18 it says, then Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days, and on the seventh day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. And to the eyes of the sons of Israel the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountain. Midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountains, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Later on in Exodus, it talks about how just him being in God's presence, it made him radiate with God's glory. God's glory was so powerful that it influenced the way Moses looked. It changed and altered him, all because of God's glory. And ultimately, you look at these first 20-some chapters of Exodus, and ultimately all of what God has done should not make us surprised about what happened in Israel. Israel's response to God's glory over and over again makes a lot of sense. Go back to Exodus chapter 20, and here's the response that Israel has to all of what God has done and to all of God's glory. In chapter 20, verse 18, it says, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood at a distance. These people see God's glory, and they respond by saying, okay, I'm impressed, I'm scared, I'm going to step back, and I don't want to have any part of this. I am intimidated because I am a broken person in the midst of a God who is worthy. And the context, before you even get to the promise, we have to understand how big God is and how broken Israel is. How big God is and how broken we are. That when we really come face to face with God's glory, we have to understand that he is so much higher than us. He can do so much more than us. And if we don't come to God in that sense, we are going to lose so much of the context of why this promise and how our lives really even intersect with who God is. If we're not impressed with God, man, we should just quit. Like, there's nothing else that I can say that's really going to change anything. God's got to be the one that changes us, and his glory is the one that changes us. So the context of the promise is God is glorious. But secondly, the content of the promise. Because much of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are laws that are given to Moses. In fact, if you count them up, you've got about 613 laws that are given between those four books. And those laws are given to these people. And in Exodus chapter 20, it kind of starts with a popular kind of thing, which is the Ten Commandments, right? Like, we've heard of the Ten Commandments. Those are written on political things all over the place. Ten Commandments are kind of a popular deal. But there were over 600 laws that were ranging from the responsibility of the citizen of Israel to the religious order of Israel. There's all sorts of things that were given in general, from do not murder to do not lie to here's specifically how the sacrifices are supposed to go. So there's a lot of laws that are given. But in Exodus chapter 19, what we see is the content of this promise that is given, and it's a pretty straightforward promise. In chapter 19, verse 3 and 4, here's the promise that is given. It says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Again, it's the context. Remember what I've done. Remember who I am. And then in verse 5 and 6, here's the promise. He says, now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. The promise is this: if, and then. If Israel obeys the law, all the 613 laws that are given over the course of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, if they obey the law, then Israel will be God's own possession, kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. There's this deal that is being garnered between them. And sometimes, man, I am the type of person to push back when a rule is posted. If a rule is posted, I'm thinking, well, how can I get out of this? Because I want to do things my way. That's just how my life operates. I know it's not the way that I should do it, but that's the way that I do it. And I try to find that freedom in that loophole. But I look at that, and God isn't just throwing out rules here to say, hey, I want control over you. He's not saying, hey, here's the laws that I've created, and Israel, I just want you to run around in my mouse trap for a little while and see how it goes. You look at these 613, and this might be the one thing that gets everybody in all of the world, off course a little bit here, is that all the laws that are given here are not simply God creating random things for us to follow. This is coming from God's very nature. It's like if I were to go to my child and say, hey, I want you to be good at basketball. And so I'm going to teach you how to play basketball. Well, that's coming because I have a love for basketball. I like how the game is played. I know how to play basketball, and so I'm going to teach my kid how to play basketball. God is saying, here's the law that I want you to follow. And in this law, what I want you to see is that it is not just merely me coming up with some random list of rules. This is me in a nutshell. This is me in my holiness. This is me in my love. This is me in my care for... I don't want you to murder somebody because I'm not somebody who just goes around killing people for fun. I don't want you to lie to people because I'm a God who tells the truth. I don't want you to be adulterous and unfaithful in your relationships because I am a faithful God. And you have to go through the law in that perspective. If we just say simply, well, yeah, God just really is trying to make my life difficult. He's just trying to give me laws for the sake of laws. We're going to miss the fact that God is displaying a perfect standard here because that's who God is. That's where this law is coming from. And that's the content of the promise. If you obey this perfect standard that I'm giving you, then there's going to be blessing because I am a God who is blessful. I am a God who is out of me. I am fullness of joy. I am a God who is peace. I am a God who is love. All the things that come from obeying the law are just simply, again, a representation of who He is. And so we go from the content of the promise to the ceremony of the promise, because this is not just a promise God's making with like a pinky promise kind of a deal or cross my heart kind of a deal. No, this is a ceremony kind of a deal. And so I want you to watch this video really quick. And I want you to kind of understand this from the context of what is being said here in Exodus.
You're still married. How many years? 40 years. 40 years. So I think people would be asking you how to do it.
Well, I tell you, if I'd have did it that way, I wouldn't have got you to probably meet me.
You know what? I'm just waiting once for the guy to say no. Okay.
Yeah.
You know that would be.
Because you have to say yes there. She may say no as soon as they walk off the court.
I think she's saying I can't do it right now.
So I really do like her. So let's just keep saying that. Wow.
How do you like that? Well, I was just joking when I said that. You know that, right?
Boy, young man, years or so.
In all reality, there is a point where if somebody offers you a promise, you are going to have to either make the decision, I'm going to accept this, or I'm going to reject this. And that is exactly what we see with God in Israel. That's exactly what we saw with that poor guy there, is that he got rejected in front of a lot of people. And he's still getting rejected in front of a lot of people. But here's what happens with the ceremony of Israel, is that God says, if you do this, then this will happen. And He presents it to them and says, now what are you going to do about this? Well, how are you going to respond? Because they had a responsibility to respond in an official ceremony. You look at chapter 24, verse 3. Exodus 24, verse 3. It says, then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances or laws. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. They respond and they say, I am all about this. I am going to take the ring. I am going to accept, and I'm going to be okay with the promise that you are offering here. Chapter 24, verse 4 through 8. Look at this. It says, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Here's the ceremony that is going to happen. He sent young men and the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. you look at verse 4 specifically, and Moses prepares an altar. Just like Abraham's covenant, if you go back to Genesis, there was an actual ceremony that was being prepared and taking place here. And the difference, though, between this one and what was happening in Genesis is that Abraham prepares the ceremony, and then Abraham goes to sleep. In this case, there's a ceremony that is being prepared, and instead of somebody going to sleep, they're all conscious for this. They're all involved in this covenant. And in verse 5, this peace offerings that are made is the entry point to the ceremony. They're sacrificing, and instead of cutting animals in half as it happened in Genesis, they're making sacrifices on an altar. In verse 6, here's what it says. It says, Moses took half of the blood out of these sacrifices and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Again, part of the ceremony. Because in what we had looked at before is that blood was the sealing property that made this ceremony actually official. Instead of putting ink on a piece of paper, blood was going to be that ink. Blood was going to be the contract signing part of this. And in verse 7, here's what happens. It says, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. He wanted to make sure that they understood, here's what you're going to sign up for. Here's what you're promising to. In the hearing of the people. And they said, all the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. This is the third time in these 4 chapters that they agree and they say, I am going to fulfill what God is what God is offering. I'm going to promise to fulfill my end of the bargain. And in verse 8, here's what happens. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. That's gross. A little bit. But again, it's not I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to initial 600 pieces of paper. It's no, this is a serious thing between them and God. And just as we looked at in Abraham's case with splitting the animals and walking through it, the idea was, hey, this is going to be done to me. This blood shedding, I'm going to shed my blood if I don't keep my end of the covenant. If I don't keep my end of the promise. You keep going in verse 8. He says, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. The modern day way of saying this is cross my heart, hope to die. Basically that's what he's saying. Is if we don't keep our end of the bargain, the blood of the judgment that's coming is on us. It's not on you, God. I'm not keeping my end of the bargain. And so here's what happens is the ceremony goes through and the people decide, hey, I am going to do this. And in a single ceremony, this is huge, in a single ceremony, the rest of the Bible and specifically the Old Testament would take on a totally different shape. The whole Old Testament would take on a different shape than was before. Instead of individuals being dealt with by God, it was this nation of Israel that had decided as a group, we are going to do what God wants us to do. We are going to fulfill the end of the bargain that we have made with God. And at the centerpiece, Israel, if they obeyed God, you look at what it said in 19, they're going to be a holy nation. They're going to be a kingdom of priests. That the whole world was going to see God's glory when they decided that they were going to end up or fulfill their end of the bargain. God's glory was going to be on display through the nation of Israel. And so we go to the next part of this, which is the conditions of the promise. The conditions of the promise. Deuteronomy chapter 28. I would encourage you to at least turn over there and skim over there. We're not going to read 65 verses today. That's a long chapter. But you look at that chapter, and man, there is a lot in there. We'll get back to it in just a second. But I want to play a game that we played on the Abrahamic Covenant day that we went through the Abrahamic Covenant. And again, I didn't get any awesome Wheel of Fortune music or anything. But the game is called Conditional or Unconditional. Like I really want there to be like a wheel or lights or something like that. But I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to tell me whether these are conditional promises or whether they're unconditional promises, because we went through this with Abraham, and we really need to understand whether this promise is a conditional promise or an unconditional promise. So first one, a contract. You sign a contract with an opt-out clause.
Conditional.
Conditional.
Okay. Anybody say unconditional? Anybody say conditional? Anybody not want to vote? Sweet. All right, second one. Raise your hand if you think it's unconditional. Marriage with a prenup. Is this unconditional? Is it conditional? Here's actually from a lawyer's website. It says prenups can be used to set rules and expectations of each other during the marriage. And that was a positive thing. They said, hey, we need to set expectations for your role in the marriage. But I would agree, it's conditional. All right, adoption. Is this a conditional promise? Unconditional. Okay. Pokemon card trading. Is this a conditional or unconditional? Conditional?
Sure. I don't know how to play the game.
Yeah, that's fair. Unconditional? It's conditional because if you want a card from somebody else, you're going to give away a card. There's an interaction that is taking place. Feeding your children. Conditional?
Totally
I don't know, did the law?
Yeah. There's some, I really want to. And this is just for like a side note, but giving to a church, charity, or nonprofit. Conditional? I'm just making you guys think on this one. Unconditional. I wanted to just put that in there because there's both sides to that coin. And again, this has nothing to do with promises, but it just made me think as I was going through it. Because sometimes we say, okay, I'm going to give as long as Matt says this. And that is a bad reason to give to anybody for anything, is to try to control. But at the same time, we don't want to just give something to somebody and just assume that it's going to the right purpose. So in your giving, whether it's to this church or to something else, I want you to be unconditional in your giving, but wise in your giving. Is that fair? Okay, cool. And again, that has nothing to do with promises, but as I was going through, I was like, that's a good, I don't know. I was just thinking through stuff. But you look at unconditional and conditional promises. Abraham's promise was a completely unconditional promise because Abraham wasn't even awake. That would be unfair if God were to just say, hey, Abraham, you agreed to all this stuff. Did I? Yeah, you were talking in your sleep, so it's fine. Emery probably could do that with me all the time. I talk in my sleep. But Deuteronomy chapter 28 proves that this is a conditional promise. Chapter 28 has 65 verses. 14 verses explain the amazing blessings that will come with obedience, the amazing things that happen. And I just want to look at this really fast because you look at these 65 verses, and I'm going to mumble through some of these things. It says, if you diligently obey the Lord, being careful to do all that He's commanded, man, all these blessings will come upon you and overtake you. It says in verse 2. It says verse 3, blessed shall be your city, your country, your offspring, your produce, the ground, the beast, the flock, the basket, the kneading bowl. When you come and go, you will be blessed when you go out. Like there's blessings upon blessings upon blessings. Verse 4, the first 14 verses, all about blessings. Then you get to verse 15. And for 54 verses, he says, if you don't end up fulfilling your end of the bargain, here's all the terrible things that are going to happen to you. All the things that are going to happen. But it shall come about if you do not obey the Lord, observe the commandments and statutes. Cursed shall be your city, your country, your basket, your kneading bowl, your offspring, the produce of the ground, the flock. When you come in and when you go out, all these things are going to be cursed. And so you look at this, you've got to understand that this covenant, by its very roots and nature, was a conditional covenant. It was not something that was just going to happen and God was just going to like look over stuff and be like, well, they tried hard. No, there's a promise that is made. And the example that we see throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, over and over and over again, plays this out. Go back to Exodus chapter 32. Right after this ceremony is done, right after these people make this covenant with God and say, hey, we are going to fulfill, we're going to do everything that you want us to do. Exodus chapter 32 happens, and all of a sudden there's a gold cow that winds up showing up right out of the blue. The very first commandment in the Ten Commandments is you shall have no other gods before me. And this is the first thing that they do. In chapter 32, there's disobedience that takes place. They don't fulfill their end of the bargain. And in verse 23 or 32, here's what it says. It says, for they said to me, Aaron said to Moses, as Moses is coming back on the scene, make a god for us who will go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them tear it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. I don't know what happened. I guess we have a calf now. That's basically what happened. And so all of a sudden you look at this and they say they disobeyed, and the negative consequence that happened is God considers wiping out every single one of these people besides for Moses and starting over. That's God's gut reaction to this, as he says, you just made this promise with me. You have not fulfilled your end of the bargain. There's consequences. Instead of him wiping them out, which is an amazing story because you got to read this, Moses prays for the people. He talks to God and says, don't do this, please. And God listens to his prayer. That's why we spend time praying on Sunday morning. That's why we pray before Sunday morning happens. That's why we pray on Wednesday. That's why we have a prayer wall in the back. That's why we're developing a prayer chain, is because we say prayer is effective. You look at James chapter 5 and you say the prayer of a righteous person is effective. That's a side note, but it's an important side note because the only reason that Israel didn't get a restart at the very beginning is because Moses prayed. But the negative consequence did happen in the fact that 3,000 people died and they were killed by their own countrymen because they realized we have to root out this idolatry from the very beginning. But I look at it and I say, what happens? What would have happened if they would have kept their end of the promise? I have an older sister. My older sister's name is Hannah. She's about 4 years older than me. And I remember growing up, there would be times when my parents would leave. And Hannah and I would either fight the entire time they were gone, or we would get along and we'd be like, when they come back, let's put on this dinner for them and these nice things. And so we would work together. And I remember that there would be times where my parents would come back and we would fight the entire time. And when they came back, it was a terrible experience because we both got consequences and we both got in trouble, and it was just a terrible feeling for the rest of the night. Or if we decided to work together and do something nice, when my parents came back, the house was full of joy and love and peace, and it was a great environment to be around. And I look at that and I say, man, if they would have obeyed, they could have had this loving family atmosphere. They could have been getting along. And that is a peace and a love in a family like that is a great, great feeling. But as a result of their disobedience, they lost out on that. You look at the next book is Leviticus. And in Leviticus chapter 10, again, what we see is this conditional promise being played out. In chapter 10 of Leviticus 10, you see Aaron. And Aaron is Moses' brother, and Aaron is the first priest. And Aaron has a couple of sons. And there's disobedience that takes place. They decided that they were going to offer sacrifices, not the way that was according to the law and the promise they had just made, but they decided that they were going to make sacrifices based on what they wanted to do. And in verse 1, here's what it says. It says, Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. They decided that they were going to do things their way. And as a result of them doing things their way, here's the negative consequence. Both of Aaron's sons were struck down. Both of them died. It says in verse 2, after fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. And I look at this and I say, if they would have just obeyed God's command, if they would have just fulfilled their end of the bargain, what would have happened? If they would have feared God's holiness, they wouldn't have died. I mean, that's the simple part of it. They would have been alive. And on top of that, these were Moses' nephews. This was close to him. Moses wouldn't have gone through the grief of this. Aaron wouldn't have gone through the grief of losing 2 kids. The people of Israel mourned because these people were died. These leaders had died. And I look at this and I say, man, separation in this way, in this death, in this physical death, all came about because they didn't fulfill that covenant, that promise with God. In Numbers chapter 13, here's what we see again, is that there's another example of them not fulfilling their bargain with the Lord, their covenant, their promise with the Lord. In chapter 13, what we see is there's disobedience because they doubted God. In other words, they ran scared sucking their thumbs to safety. Chapter 13, verse 27 and 28. Here's what it says. It says, "Thus they told him and said, 'We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit.'" So these spies go into the land, the promised land that they're going to, that was promised to Abraham. They get in, they come back with this bountiful amount of fruit and this great stuff that's in the land. And yet here's what it says in verse 28. "Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there." They get scared. They say, "Hey, instead of me believing that God can and will fight for us, I'm going to be scared." And fear is infectious. Doubt is a destroyer of the camaraderie and unity around this. And it is going to continue to destroy faith if it's not left unchecked. Look at verse 31, chapter 13, 31. It says, "But the men who had gone up with him said, 'We are not able to go against the people, for they are too strong for us.' So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, 'The land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size.'" And so they start to spread this around to the people around them, and this fear continues to spread. This doubt continues to spread, and it continues to go. And I look at this, and I mean, everywhere in your relationship is going to spread. It is going to continue to get worse and worse if doubt is left unchecked. And instead of them trusting in what God wanted for them, they decided, hey, we are going to, instead of this doubt being left unchecked, I lost my train of thought. Instead of this doubt being left unchecked, if that wouldn't have been unchecked, the nation of Israel would have continued to doubt God, and they would have gone their own way. It looks at in chapter 14, verse 1 through 4, what they say is we want to go back. We don't even want to be here anymore. We want to go back to this Egypt that doesn't have anything left. It's just been destroyed by God, and yet, hey, we're going to go back there. We don't want Moses anymore. He hasn't done anything for us. We're going to go back. And in their doubt, God looks at this and says, wait a minute, I have just done all of this for you, and yet you are not going to trust me in this? You're not going to obey me in this? And the negative consequence of this is an entire generation winds up dying off. He says, you guys can't go into the land because of this. You guys don't get to experience the blessing because you've been disobedient to what I'm asking you to do. And again, I mean, in chapter 14, verse 21, 29 and 30, God threatens to wipe out Israel again because they have doubted what God has said. The only reason he doesn't is because of the unconditional promise that he made to Abraham. And this is where these intersection of this promises are made, is that some of these promises, I mean, you see these conditional promises and the negative response of these things is because of their disobedience. But God decides, I'm going to remain faithful only because of my unconditional promise that has been made. If they would have kept their promise, if Israel would have kept their promise, it would have saved them from all the consequences, all the negative things that they had to go through. And yet they disobeyed. And so we end with the continuation of this promise, because the promise that was made here is a promise that was unlike Abraham's. It wasn't eternal. It wasn't everlasting. It wasn't going to continue to go forward. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18 says this. It says, I will raise up a prophet from among you, from among their countrymen, like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him to do. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, what we see is that this promise is built on a promise going into the future. That Deuteronomy, in chapter 18, verse 18, Moses says, hey, there's going to be a prophet that is going to come later. And this promise is not going to be an eternal promise like the promise that was given to Abraham. This promise is going to continue to go until this prophet comes, and he kind of brings it to a climax. And so in chapter 18, what we see is it's the beginning, but it's also the end of this promise. That this promise was never meant to be the end all. It was never meant to be the thing that shaped all of eternity. It was specifically for Israel, and it was specifically for a time. And until that prophet came, a system was set in place. And that system carried on for 1,500 years. And then that prophet that is referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, comes in the person of Jesus Christ. That Deuteronomy is prophesying about Jesus. And when Jesus came, what we see is all throughout the New Testament, we say, hey, the law, man, it's not necessary. Here's Titus chapter 3, verse 9. It says, avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law. He's saying, hey, I want you to not worry about the law that was so important to Israel back then. That's not something that you should be spending all of your time debating. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. This promise, that was a conditional promise back in the Old Testament, was something that Jesus came to fulfill. Romans 10, chapter 10, verse 4. For Christ is the end of the what? Law. For righteousness, everyone who believes. Christ is the end of the law. He's not fulfilling it in a sense that now we've got to fulfill it too. He is the end of the law. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10 says this, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. Jesus came and brought a time of reformation in order that the law and the covenant that was made to Moses is no longer necessary. It is reformed. Colossians chapter 2, verse 14 says this. It says, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. The legal obligation, the law, the covenant that was put before Moses and the people of Israel has been nailed to the cross. It's not against us anymore. That's not what we are supposed to be fulfilling. And then in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, if you get nothing else out of today, I hope that you understand this. Therefore, the law, the conditional promise, the covenant that was made to Moses, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. The whole purpose for you and for me here sitting today, looking at the Mosaic Covenant, is for us to say that covenant is supposed to lead us to the person of Jesus. So when we read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we see all these laws that are put into place there. Those laws are not for you to say, well, now we got to do sacrifices, and now we got to do this, and now we got to do this. No, all those things are supposed to point us to Jesus Christ. And if we don't get pointed back to Jesus Christ, what that means is that you and I are going to try to hopelessly to do what Israel tried to do in fulfilling those laws. And if you try to live a life that is lived by fulfilling laws, what you're going to find out is Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, those things that we just talked about are going to be true in your life too. That as you try to live by the law, you are going to die by the law. As you try to hold up a standard that you say, hey, here's what I need to be doing, you're going to be crushed underneath that standard. There is no hope in that. Jesus accomplished what Israel had already failed to do and will continue to fail to do. Because that law is not an end in itself. It is only a tutor to lead us to Christ. The promise God made to Abraham was a one-sided, unilateral, and unconditional type of promise. You look at the promise that was made to Israel, and the promise God made to Israel through Moses was a two-sided, bilateral, and conditional promise. Those are totally separate promises. Totally separate in how they were fulfilled and how they were supposed to be played out. And the big word today that we have is the word standard. Because at the end of the day, God puts his standard of perfection into the Mosaic Covenant. He says, here's my standard. Here's my holy standard. And then we as broken people are put into a place of saying, am I going to try to fulfill this law? Or am I going to cast myself on a Savior that can try to do something that I am incapable of doing? And Am I going to go to a Savior, or am I going to go to myself? Because at the end of the day, that's where we're at. Because in our brokenness, we can't do it on our own. We can't do it on our own. And so God's standards is put before us in the first 5 books of the Bible. And as we look at that standard, we have to come to grips with the fact that we need a Savior. Israel had to come to grips with the fact that they needed somebody to redeem them that was not themselves. I was convicted this past week because I realized that it's easy to kind of teach through truth and not get to the heart of the fact that at some point this has to intersect with your life and my life. And so I'm trying something, and this could be a real big flop. It could be a really good thing. I don't know. But I think that each time that we do a time of teaching, I really feel like we need to come away with 2 types of application. One application is for your personal spiritual health, and then one type of application should be for the global outreach and mission of the gospel. Because us as a church, we have a mission and a co-mission to go and share the gospel, not just with my family, but with the world. And so I'm going to start, as we look at this promise, the application for today for your personal spiritual health. If you want to be spiritual healthy, here's what I would encourage you to do. Stop being a legalist. Stop being a legalist. Let go of moral obligations that you put on yourself and on other people. If you come to church and you say, I'm coming to church because I'm such a good person.
That's right.
If I say, hey, well, I look around this room and that seat's empty, that person's not there because they're a bad person. And we start to evaluate ourselves on this standard and say, well, I'm fulfilling all these things, but these people aren't doing these things. And then when I do fail, I say, man, I'm a terrible person because I didn't do these. All of a sudden, if we are living our life on a moral obligation of these are the standards that I'm trying to put into myself, we have to understand God is the perfect standard. There is no other standard. Any standard that I put on myself, any standard that you put on yourself, it's not going to work. You're not the judge, so let it go. Stop judging yourself. Stop judging other people. Let it go. So for today, what in your life are you holding on to as a measuring stick of your success? Let it go. Who in your life are you holding to a high standard who you need to show grace? Release them and let them go. Because at the end of this, we've got to exchange self-righteousness with grace. Because we're never going to meet God's standard apart from it. Secondly, for a global or outreach-centered application, this Sunday, I want you to think about what we talked about, but I want you to think of some person that's in your life that you could say, hey, I learned about this law thing, and I learned that it's impossible to fulfill this standard, this 10 Commandments deal. Can I share with you why my pastor said that? And take them to Galatians chapter 3:24. That it says, hey, it's a tutor to lead them to Christ. I want you to find somebody. I want you to think of somebody in your life. Before we quit, before we leave, before we move on, somebody in your life, and I want to challenge you, would you be willing to go up to them this week and say, hey, this Sunday we talked about this thing called a covenant or a Mosaic Covenant or the law or however you want to phrase it. This Sunday I learned it's impossible to obey all that God said, even just the 10 Commandments, because 10 Commandments are kind of a common thing. Can I share with you why my pastor said that? And have them read Galatians 3:24, because oftentimes it's going to be more effective for them to read it than for you to try to rehash what I've just thrown up on you guys. But again, in your life, in order for you to be spiritually healthy, you got to show yourself some grace and some people around you grace, because they're never going to meet the standard that you think that they're going to have. And secondly, we've got to take this message to somebody else in our life. Because at the heart of the Mosaic Covenant, man, I feel almost sad for the Israelites as they kind of chanted together, we are going to obey all that God has said that we're going to do. Because immediately after that, they fell on their face. Ultimately, Jesus is the only one that we can have hope in.